19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued warnings to the
This movie reportedly cost $50 million to make. It depicts a modern-day civil war between the U.S. government and coalition breakaway states, call them the rebels, led by California and Texas. Yes, California and Texas, two highly unlikely allies fighting side by side with all the killing toys of modern warfare against the equally, if not overpowering, might of the evil empire in Washington. Both sides commit war crimes. How did this fictional Civil War II kick off? The president, whomever you may wish to relate him to, got too greedy, became a dictator, and started stealing from and suppressing the freedoms of states to run their own affairs. Here's director Alex Garland speaking after the film's premiere at South by Southwest.
There's a lot of things that are clearly answered. One is there is a fascist, corrupt president who's smashing the Constitution, attacking their own citizens, and that is a very clear answered statement. And if you want to think about why Texas and California might be allied and putting aside their political differences, the answer would be implicit in that. So I think answers are there, questions are raised, answers are there, but you have to step to it and not expect to be spoon-fed these things. I think that all of the topics in this film have been a part of a huge public debate for years and years and years. The debate's been growing and growing in volume and in awareness, but none of it is secret or unknown to almost anybody. You can't say everybody because that would be too big a generalization, but very, very broadly, I felt everybody understands these terms, and at that point I just felt compelled to write about it. If you cast your mind back to, so I wrote this in June 4 years ago, which was, there was an election coming, we were just dealing with COVID. Same conversation as now, identical. So that's where it came from.
So in this fictional plot, California and Texas, with their two-star flag, symbolize left and right putting their differences aside and working in unison for the higher purpose of saving democracy. With that premise, the producers might have been trying to avoid taking sides in the real American divisions we see and hear every day. Left versus right, both convinced that the other is a threat to democracy. The director even alludes to these real divisions in America.
Warnings are all out there. Everybody is aware of the warnings on both sides, all sides of the political divide.
And the Western forces of Texas and California.
I will do a follow-up post in the near future on the critics' reaction to the movie Civil War.
God bless America.
In the meantime, here's another example of what appears to be growing interest, at least among some Americans, over the prospect of violence during this election year and or in the wake of the election results. It's a board game, not dissimilar in appearance to Monopoly or other games you and your family might have at home. But this one is called 2040, An American Insurgency, a, quote, simulation of America's next Civil War. It comes in a free student edition and a more complex version for sale. The basic findings of this design research is that a civil war in this country at this time would not be swift or tidy. It would be awful, a guerrilla-style conflict that lasts for decades. End of quote from the game's website. Here's a summary of the game's 4 fighting Civil War factions. Number 1, the state. Whoever's in charge will be trying to calm the whole country. Number 2, the rebels. They are, of course, trying to overthrow the state. They might be left-wing or right-wing. Vigilantes. They are pro-government militias, but under little or no government control, and go on a bloodthirsty rampage against the rebels. Number 4, organized criminals. Armed criminal gangs in America, already active, highly organized, and often violent during robberies, will harness the national Civil War chaos to operate with little police interference in an effort to gain more wealth and power. The game's designer is Edward Castronova, a professor of media at Indiana University in Bloomington. He specializes in synthetic worlds and their economies, sometimes referred to as virtual economy.
The first impulse for the game was the chants of "lock her up" that came out of the Trump movement in 2016.
Regarding
Hillary Clinton. And, I've had a long run history of interest in military and political simulations and the stories of how those events happen. And one important marker of social breakdown is when political leaders start talking about arresting their opponents. Because if you think about the dynamic, Mike, if you and I are competing for something and I start saying, I'm going to arrest you, and you start saying you're going to arrest me, well, then the winner of this game is the person who arrests first. So it creates this, once you start hearing people saying they're basically willing to do almost anything to put their opponent away, that is a sign of a breakdown in the rules. I'm a game designer. I like games. So, imagine a game of Monopoly where you start to think that the other players are saying, you know what, I'm sick of this. I'm just going to take money. I'm just going to take it out of the bank. And you'll have to stop me. Well, if one person's saying it and another, then you start saying, even though I'm not the kind of person who would break that rule, I don't want to lose. So I'm going to start doing it too. So this change in our political rhetoric, or the strategy space, let's say, I really started to see in 2016, 2017. And then there have been a number of incidents. I'm sure you're as familiar with them as I am. I view the Kavanaugh hearings as an important breaking of rules.
Or the Supreme Court.
Yeah, the Kavanaugh's nomination hearings in the Senate for the Supreme Court. And, I don't think it makes any sense to go into the weeds, but I've observed various things like that and said, it looks like both sides are starting to ignore the written rules. And of course, the future of things like that is actual fighting. And I don't like that. So I decided I started to just play around with game pieces saying, what happens if this actually breaks out here?
And as time went on, up until this year, you must have thought about other signals, other indications. So feel free to talk about those.
Well, okay. So I actually think the very first step away from the rule of law, as I understood it when I was growing up, was in 2009. Actually, the passage of this very, very large healthcare act that didn't follow approved procedure. It was supposed to pass the Senate and could not because of a special election in Massachusetts, which actually sent a Republican directly in opposition to the bill. And so it was passed through a budget resolution process. And I looked at that and I said, wow. And then there was the erosion of the norm.
Why did you say wow about that? And by the way, just for the record, we're referring to what bill?
The ACA, right? The healthcare bill, what was now called Obamacare. Okay, so the normal process for any bill would be it has to pass the House with a majority and the Senate with a 60-40 vote. Okay, for any kind of major bill. This is a massive bill. This wasn't just a little thing. And what happened then was the Senate was, the Senate was 60-40 in favor of it. And then Ted Kennedy died, leaving open a seat in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, the special election to replace him was all about the ACA, was all about Obamacare. And there was so much opposition to it that they actually sent a Republican to replace Ted Kennedy, leaving the supporters of the bill in a pickle because they now only had 59-41 in the Senate. And ordinarily that would have been the end. But because of, I guess, a quirk in the rules that they could exploit, that it had passed the House, which meant, as I think, as a budget bill, and so it could be handled by the Senate as a budget bill. And so in the budget reconciliation process, they handled it, and that only requires a majority vote in the Senate.
But
so they,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, to me, it was an indication of, well, this thing is really, really huge, but we're gonna handle it differently from what it traditionally was.
But on the surface, it sounds like politics may be a little unusual, but how did you see it fitting into the pattern of what you've come to see as precursors to possible civil war?
So when people stop following the rules, that makes the other side say, now, wait a minute, you kind of cheated that one in. And I get it. It's politics. And if it was an isolated incident, maybe it doesn't matter.
So at this stage, beginning back to 2009 and up to the Trump campaign, throw Hillary in jail, et cetera, what beyond that were you beginning to also see that was rattling around the back of your head is, this looks like possible trouble?
So the shenanigans with Merrick Garland's nomination were perhaps the next step. So that's a few years after 2009. So the Democrats had gotten rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, but then the Republicans abused that power in the Trump years to put people on the Supreme Court that under the old process never would have gotten there. Okay. So that sort of started with the Merrick Garland nomination being on the table after it became apparent that the Senate was going to that what was it? It was after Trump won the election, but hadn't taken office yet, I believe, and the Republican-controlled Senate refused to move on Merrick Garland until Trump was president. And then he appointed Neil Gorsuch, and then Neil Gorsuch got in. So that kind of, to me, again, it looks like maneuvering, but I think there are a lot of Democrats today who say that was an absolute cheat of the system not to have a vote on Merrick Garland.
But did you see that as illegal or something beyond just shady politics?
The latter. Okay, when you're talking about a body of people who say we're going to follow these rules, and then they don't follow those rules, it's not illegal, but it is a sign that each side is sending to themselves, to the others, that, maybe these rules don't really bind us anymore.
Interesting developments that you're laying out. Continue by all means.
So, all right. So then we get Trump and the claim that, Hillary had broken. Yeah. And then we moved into criminality, accusations of criminality. So there was the accusation against candidate Clinton that she had done something funky with her emails. Okay. People make accusations. We have a court process, I suppose, but we really haven't heard too much, at least in my lifetime. We've always heard candidates being called communists and Hitler and all these sorts of things, but really put the candidate in jail, win the election, and put the candidate in jail. I hadn't really heard that rhetoric at all. And then I mentioned with Kavanaugh that there was some breaking in normal procedure there that outraged people. There were people who were very, very angry. I don't think that there's any merit to the idea that 2020 was a stolen election, voting machines. I don't think there's any merit to that. But I think there is some merit to the idea that big technology and media and the Democratic Party worked hard together to shape the information space. I mean, I just cite the quashing of the Hunter Biden narrative and the widespread propagation of the Gretchen Whitmer narrative. So Gretchen Whitmer, we now found out that the plot was, let's say, heavily infused with FBI influence, but it came out in October, October surprise, that's normal in an election. So the Democrats' October surprise was that the governor of Michigan, that there was a plot to capture her and take her hostage. So, and that received normal October surprise treatment. But the Hunter Biden laptop, it was discovered, was left at a repair shop, and then the FBI had it and it analyzed it and determined that it was valid. And when the New York Post attempted to report what it knew about that situation, I personally was shocked to see it not appear in the Times, the Post, CBS News. I was shocked to hear that a newspaper, the New York Post, was knocked off of Twitter until the election was over. Those sorts of things were really shocking to me. And so I think, if we were going to talk about, was the 2020 election fair? Well, I don't remember any election that had that kind of, heavy censorship on one side, or self-censorship. Okay, so it's not like the government, but this kind of agreement among widely separated power centers, technology, media, a party, and suddenly they all seem to be acting in concert to silence something that is of import to at least half the country. That turned out to be true. And then there's the CIA involvement, where we have this letter of 50 people saying, no, it's Russian disinformation. We now know that was cooked up by people inside the government, and inside the CIA, say, let's get a bunch of retired people together to say it was Russian information. Of course, it turns out it wasn't. But all the media said, oh, you see, it's Russian disinformation. We don't have to pay any attention. So I step back and I look at that, because I've seen Republicans doing things and I see Democrats doing things. And this idea of dirty tricks in politics now, it seemed to me, has sort of started to go to the next level.
So something at that stage is incubating with you. You're not thinking Civil War games at this point, I gather, but subsequent to the 2020 election, you started thinking about it. Tell me about that process.
Well, actually, I already started to work on the game.
Oh, really?
After 2018. Yeah, it was ultimately what happened with Kavanaugh, and then this sense, people on both sides saying, this is hopeless. We can't reason with those other people. They're crazy. Like, both sides are saying this. They're living in a bubble. They're indoctrinated. They're under the thumb of some cult-like ideology. So, and then you'd see articles like, is there going to be a civil war in the United States? How are we going to come to a compromise? So that is what actually started the game. And it's just been these other events as they've been going along, and you see the tension rising, that make the game seem more relevant. And many of you don't know that it takes a long time to publish a game. So I had the basic design done in 2018, 2019, and it only came out last year in 2023.
And as it came out, do you feel that the game reflects what we're seeing in this election year in terms of what could lead up to this theoretical Civil War II in America?
Yeah, it's the curse of every dystopian thinker to see that horrible future ratchet closer than he ever imagined. So I put the game in the year 2040, thinking, if things continue like this, it'll get awful by 2040. And here in 2024, we're seeing, you mentioned in your email the kind of rhetoric coming out of Trump, the bloodbath, things like that. But at the same time, he's under indictment all over the country, and he just had a judgment go against him in a way that I think most legal experts say is unprecedented, uncalled for. And so, there's plenty of ground for both sides to say the other side is breaking the law on us. The other side is a real threat to democracy. See, and this language was not going on in 2018, 2019, not even so much in 2020. But now we have both sides saying not only that their opponent is some kind of criminal, let's say, or should be arrested, but is a dictator on the way. Both sides are saying that the democracy itself is at stake. And if democracy itself is truly at stake, what would we not do as good Americans? We would do almost anything to save our democracy, wouldn't we?
Well, there are polls that indicate a substantial number of, for example, Republicans. I can't recite the details, so forgive me for that. But a large number of people, and I forget what the party breakdown is, would have said, I would support violence in support of a political idea. Fewer of them said I would participate, but that in itself, those questions and the fact that they get a substantial response in that direction must be worrisome.
It certainly is. I'm also worried about the deployment of political violence on the left, of course. So there's a lot of damage in those riots in the 20s, in 2020, and we know there are repeated incidents of what we would call Antifa elements taking to the streets over various causes. So I'm just, throughout this conversation, what I would always like to do is preserve my neutrality, right? Because as the designer, I don't really want to be seen as taking sides. So yes, a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives are very angry, and some of them are saying it is time to, clean out the swamp. We can't, I saw someone say, we can't vote our way out of this, right? You hear that kind of rhetoric on the right. But on the left, we hear things like arrest all the anti-vaxxers and put them in camps. Fuck your freedoms, the famous statement by a former governor of California. Can you imagine that? Fuck your freedoms. This is a major political actor. Well, if you're fucking my freedoms, I'm fucking yours, right? Who's going to do it first? And I apologize for that language, but it was not my choice of language. And it is it's a widespread clip as well. The media has not hesitated to say what this guy said. So I just want to keep a balance. There's bad rhetoric on both sides.
I understand, and I appreciate your forensic presentation, and we can leave people to imagine what you're thinking, when the door is closed. But okay. That notwithstanding, we have reached a point in 2024 when sizable people on both sides of the political divide believe the other side is an existential threat, a serious threat to their freedom, and people have strong cases or strongly voiced cases on both sides of that issue.
Mm-hmm.
A movie is out that's going to take that over the tipping point in a fictional war called, as you know, A24, with massive weapons being used. Now, I've had considerable experience being in civil wars as a journalist. My first one was 2 years of being shot at in Lebanon in the 70s. And the constant thing that I remember speaking to people on both sides, or to all 3 or 4 sides of that civil war, very nice people would take you in and feed you and so forth. But if they thought you were smuggling arms across their green line, they would shoot you. They all felt that they had been aggrieved, that the other side was a serious threat to their existence, and that they were civilized and the other side is not, and totally unreasonable. However, the level of arms fed by other states made it possible for it to be a serious armed conflict. The idea in this movie coming up is that suddenly, somehow, both sides have all the modern weapons available to mankind. I don't know how realistic that is. But in in a place like America, it seems to me more likely that that if there are sporadic violence in the wake of the next year's election, as Trump seems to imply is possible, or other people imply might be possible, on both sides, it's more than likely to involve not that kind of gruesome, gigantic military presence you see in the movie, but things like that are possible. It doesn't take much to make trouble.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
how do you size that up?
I agree with you. I think first I'd like to thank you for your service to humanity, for putting your life in danger in these war zones. I extend that. I work to all journalists. I extend it to all journalists. I work in a media school, and journalists are unsung heroes. So that having been said, in making the game, I did a fairly careful study of the kind of conflicts that it sounds like you have experience with. So I'm seeing them from 60,000 feet. And I agree with you that it tends to be a very dirty, ugly, sort of constant damage at a low level. In other words, you don't have, like the American Civil War, the first one, there's gray over here and there's blue over here, and we're going to march up in lines. Or World War II, where we have, here's the Red Army and the Nazis, and no, the war is everywhere and nowhere. It's at any moment, people know that there could be an explosion, or suddenly a firefight would break out somewhere. So the design of the game is taken from simulations that have been coming out of the national security space and the defense space. So they've actually simulated numerous of these kinds of conflicts. So, for example,
just jump in before we get too far along that line. And first, let's tell folks what kind of, board games, Monopoly. So,
right.
Taking that idea, what is basically your game? How does it look like? And then we can talk about these things.
Good.
Thinking of.
So, imagine a board game like Monopoly, except instead of having a track around the edge, the board is a map of the United States broken up into regions, and the players are able to put pieces in the regions. And the winner of the game is the player who controls the most population. So each region has like a little population score, which is like a victory points. And the player's goals are to control as much population as possible. And so the game process is, I sit here and I have some cards that let me do things, put new pieces down, move them, attack the opponent's pieces. And so my job is to try and move these pieces around in such a way that I cover as much of the population as I can. And what that means is, if I'm red, that means that there's more population in red controlled areas than blue. Okay, so now
red does not represent the right here.
No, so it does have red and blue, but the convention in military simulation is for government forces to always be blue, or us to always be blue, and rebel forces and enemies to be red. And so that's the blue and red here.
That's a military, long established.
Yeah. And let me just explain briefly how that plays out. You can set up this game to reflect any kind of political situation you want. I offer the players two scenarios: one in which the government is right wing, and there's an armed rebellion in cities. Okay, and in that case, the government's blue and the cities are all red. The other one would be a left wing government. So then the government would be blue, and then there's a revolution, armed rebellion in the countryside.
And so your board game allows for that switch.
Yeah, and numerous others. So if someone wants to play out what would happen if Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Ohio, the Northwest Territories, decided to secede, and then they would all be red and the government would be blue, and how do we bring them back in? So you could do almost anything.
Well, let's check
judgments
that.
on the
Okay,
system. Yeah.
very interesting. Let's check that against a possibility in 2025. If you get very angry states in red or blue or Democrat or Republican, and some of them can control their state legislatures and they want to do something like that. Is that possible? Can you see
Absolutely.
that possibility? I mean,
Yeah,
in real terms.
I mean, the history of saying the presidential election was not legitimate goes all the way back to the year 2000. I mean, if you look at every single election since, there have been some people saying it's not legitimate. But what changed in 2020 was the attempt to send false electors to Washington. So let's imagine false electors coming from somewhere. How does that become an armed conflict? I'm not so sure. Perhaps I think it becomes armed conflict if a state says, we don't recognize the president. We will no longer follow this law, and this law. Okay. And then you have a reason for outside authorities to send troops into the state to enforce the law. I
And
think
also maybe within that state or around the nation, people who agree with that particular state might gravitate toward it with
Absolutely.
ideas of taking extra legal action themselves.
Absolutely. If you'd like, I could spin out another scenario that I wonder about and worry about. So let's say Donald Trump is convicted of something. And instead of reporting for his punishment, he goes to Montana and says, come and get me. And he calls all of his friends to come out and surround him and say, you're going to have to, I want you to stand there and make them fight through my people to get to me. And I wonder, what does the Secret Service do if the person they're protecting says, these policemen coming to arrest me are enemies? They're threatening my life. You have to protect me from them. So that's...
Or does the Secret Service just
let him
take him back to the White House?
Yeah, right. I mean, but these are the sort of little sparks. And what my game says is that once some spark like that occurs, then we have right versus left people doing things all over. We have in suburban Phoenix, someone blows up the FBI building. In downtown Indianapolis, someone destroys a church, or perhaps not a church, but the Republican Party headquarters is destroyed, or we already have a pattern in our country of attacking companies for their politics. So someone burns down a Hobby Lobby, or someone blows up a bomb at Disney. And I think it just escalates from there. It's just everyone now has a reason to say that the other side is barbaric and unreasonable, and therefore I must go out and just like what you saw in Lebanon.
But to be clear, your board game does not give an option that say Donald Trump does this or that. It doesn't so much say what the cause of the Civil War is, but once it starts, your game starts, as it were.
Yeah, because my point was to use mechanics that we know and believe will happen. So mechanics of social, political, military interaction, and then demonstrate them to the player. So the player can say, my goodness, this would be horrible. It would be awful to put our country into this situation, something like what Lebanon experienced, what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia. We do not want this here. And just by displaying the mechanics after this conflict starts, I hope is enough to sort of vaccinate people against any kind of military urge that they have.
Well, that leads to the next question. I'm sure you're aware of the pros and cons that people might be expressing about this game and or having this out there along with a movie that we know about in an election year. What do you suppose your market audience is?
For the most part, these type of games have a limited audience. They're limited to people who are very interested in complicated simulations. Okay. And so I don't think it's the sort of thing that will catch on like wildfire. The rule book is something like 20 pages long with very fine print. So it's not the sort of thing that you just throw on the table on a Friday night and have the family sit around. I mean, you have to be a true war simulation nerd, I think, to really get into this game and play it. Now, I did make a high school version. It's much simpler. It's called American Abyss Student Edition. And that has gotten quite a few downloads, but I don't really know, because it's free. I don't know if people are enjoying it or not, but it's a very, very simple attempt to deliver the same message.
You mentioned your wish that you hope it is a vaccination against going into a situation like that people will stop and think about it, people on all sides. That is an argument that is made, that people might see it as a wake-up call and might help us keep from going too far. Others say it's a MAGA fantasy, that it's or a left-wing extremist fantasy, that it would say, hey, this is cool. We may be onto something. Our whole prep culture and militarization, and maybe people are finally recognizing us as players in this potential situation. Where do you come down now?
Well, I hope it's not the latter. I hope because I've had the experience of playing, for example, a game like this that's about Vietnam, and I don't know anyone who's walked away from playing that game saying, "Wow, I wish we'd gotten ourselves deeper into that." That was a conflict that it was just valuable to all sides, and we should have really leaned into it. I've never met anyone who's had that reaction to actually playing through Vietnam. And believe me, there are games about it that are very accurate and do a really good job. So I still have like the artist's hubris of saying, no, players won't react that way. But of course they could. But, art is a statement about a view of life. And so even in itself, like, what if someone said, oh, this is horribly irresponsible to do this? I think the movie is actually more irresponsible than a game, because people like to watch soldiers doing things and destruction. They like to watch those kinds of visuals. Believe me, people playing my game are not going to sit there saying, wow, this is just so much fun and exciting. So I'll argue in favor of that, but generally I'll argue in favor of art, that artists really should have the freedom to make whatever they make and expose it to the public. And if an artist feels something strongly, he should speak.
Well, clearly you've watched and feel there's a strong pattern moving in an alarming direction. What's your hunch as to what you and I might be talking about this time next year?
Well, I'll be frank. I don't think Trump is going to get into office. I don't think the powers that be will allow it, based on what I've seen in terms of their willingness to do almost anything to stop him in 2020. I just, my gut, again, we're talking about gut here, but I think so many intelligent, important, powerful people believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to this country, that they will do anything by hook or by crook to prevent him from taking office. Okay. So, but what would be the consequences of that? So depending on how this all plays out, it could be done in a way that really puts the pickup truck folks on the streets. So there's that. If he does manage to become president, I think our cities will burn. I think there will be massive riots against him, again, because of the power, the wealth, the intellect of the people who think he's an existential threat. I think the way to play Trump, I think we've all made a mistake. I think if everyone celebrated him and treated him like the God emperor that he wants to be in 2017, he would have been eating out of our hands by now, because that's what he wants. I don't think he wants to. But if there's rioting in the streets, I can't say that he wouldn't send in the National Guard, and who knows where it goes from there. Okay, so I guess my hunch is split But my guess is that something will happen. I'm not sure either Biden or Trump will make it to the election.
Neither one of them will make it to the election?
Yeah, I don't think many Democrats are super excited about the Biden presidency, for reasons there's no point in us getting into. But I think all of America would be happier with Newsom versus DeSantis than what we have now, and there's a lot of time left. Okay, so I think we're in a very dangerous moment. Any number of these things could go south. Let's not forget World War I. Let's not forget that. That was an international incident that seemed to be under control, being handled well as late as July 20th or 21st. And by August 6th, they were in the field shooting at one another. So depending on how the various actors in this situation, depending on their choices, things could be done that turn up the temperature too high. And I hope not. I pray not. But I think we're at risk.
Edward, thank you very much for a very disturbing series of thoughts.
I apologize. Thank you.
I hope nothing personal, but let's hope your game never is played for real.
I agree. Thank you very much. I agree completely.